I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, but I just want to take one moment briefly to acknowledge a very special guest in the audience, Senator Velma Montgomery, who's here with us tonight. Senator Montgomery is no stranger to this institution. She has been an amazing supporter of ours, and her deep commitment to civic discourse, to problem solving on the political level has been astonishing, and she never stops, and we thank you for that. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight Ari Berman, who is here with us to talk about voting rights. Ari is a senior reporter for Mother Jones. He's a fellow at the Nation Institute. He has written extensively about American politics, voting rights, and the intersection of money and politics. Don't know what that's about. Berman was the first national reporter to cover voter suppression during the 2012 election, earning widespread acclaim for his coverage and pushing the issue into the national spotlight. His stories have also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and The Nation. He's a frequent guest and commentator on MSNBC, C-SPAN, and NPR. In 2017, Berman won the Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media. He's the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, about the history of voting rights since 1965, and Herding Donkeys, the fight to rebuild the Democratic Party and reshape American politics. He graduated from the Medill School of Journalism, my alma mater, Northwestern University, with a degree in journalism and political science. He's also a new dad. So, yay, dads. Ari will speak tonight. He'll answer questions, and he has very kindly agreed to stay and sign books of Give Us the Ballot, which is on sale in the shop in the back there. And so we encourage you to stay, ask questions, and join us till the end. Thanks for coming. Ari, welcome.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out and braving the heat, and thank you for welcoming a Manhattanite to Brooklyn. It's usually the opposite these days, but I'm the last of a dying breed. And I was getting a tour before I came up here of this building, and Stephen was telling me that this building was built in the 1880s. And I was thinking about what was going on in the 1880s as it pertains to voting rights. And the fact is, a lot of people in this room would not have been able to vote at that point in time. Women couldn't vote. African Americans couldn't vote. Latinos couldn't vote. Native Americans couldn't vote. The right to vote was very narrowly restricted, largely to white male property owners. And so it's interesting when you think about the history and you think of these beautiful buildings and what they represent, and then you also think of the other side of America, the other part of American history. And that's kind of how I came to this subject matter. And honestly, for me, the right to vote was something that I didn't think a whole lot about for most of my life. I didn't grow up in the segregated South. My parents didn't meet marching in Selma. I knew about the Voting Rights Act. I knew about the importance of voting rights, but it was kind of an abstract issue for me. And really, for me, my come to Jesus moment, even though I'm Jewish, was after the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from blue to red or became a whole lot redder. We began to see a wave of new attempts following the election of the first black president to make it harder to vote. Things like requiring strict forms of ID that you never needed in any previous election, or cutting back on early voting days in states that had early voting, or reducing the number of polling places, or purging people from the voting rolls. And this was not an isolated occurrence. From 2011 to 2012, there were 180 new voting restrictions introduced in 41 states. And half the states in the country changed their election laws. And so I view this as a very disturbing development for democracy and also a really important story to cover, which is how I first started covering this as a journalist. Then after the 2012 election, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the central part of the Voting Rights Act and then gutted the Voting Rights Act, ruling that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to clear their voting changes with the federal government. And that got me a lot deeper into the history, and I began asking people I knew, lawyers, academics, activists, very basic questions about the Voting Rights Act. What did it do? Why is it being challenged? Wasn't this settled 50 years ago? And to my surprise, there were a lot of interesting historical articles about the Voting Rights Act, but no one had really written a book about what happened after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the 50 years between 1965 and the present day. And so that's what really led me to write my book, Give Us the Ballot, about the history of voting rights. And the title of that book comes from the first major speech that Martin Luther King gave about voting rights in May of 1957. And it's really a remarkable speech. He was only 28 years old at the time, and 25,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for an event called the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom. This was 2 years after the Montgomery bus boycott led by Rosa Parks and Dr. King, and it was just the beginning of what we think of as the contemporary civil rights movement. What King was saying in this speech was that every right that the civil rights movement wanted to achieve, the right to be able to go to school where they wanted, the right to be able to eat where they wanted, the right to be able to marry who they wanted, the right to be treated as full citizens under the law. None of that could be achieved without the right to vote. That was the one right that was going to make all of these other rights possible. So that speech in 1957 led to this 8-year effort that culminated in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I always like to remind people what the country was like before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. You had a situation in places like Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote. If you tried to register in Selma and you were African American, you were told to name all 67 county judges to get on the voting rolls. Something that I'm pretty sure the 67 county judges themselves wouldn't have been able to do had they ever been asked that question. In Mississippi, only 6.7% of African Americans in the entire state were registered to vote. There were people from New York, like Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, who went down to Mississippi and never came back because they were murdered trying to simply get people registered to vote. That was America before 1965. What the Voting Rights Act did that was so important was it struck down the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the grandfather clauses that prevented so many people from being able to register. So you no longer had to name all 67 county judges to be able to register to vote. And what it did over a longer period of time was it said to those states with the longest histories of discrimination, largely in the South but not exclusively, there were parts of New York that were covered by this as well, that those places had to approve their voting changes with the federal government so they didn't discriminate in the future. Because the Supreme Court and the Congress knew full well, you struck down one literacy test, you struck down one poll tax, these states were just going to come up with a new one unless you shifted the burden of discrimination from those facing discrimination to those doing the discriminating. So it was a remarkably successful piece of legislation, really one of the most successful pieces of legislation ever passed by the Congress. And in my view, it really made the promise of American democracy real for the first time in our country's history. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there has been a 50-year effort, 50-year plus at this point, to roll back the Voting Rights Act and to roll back voting rights more broadly. The first thing that happened was right after the Voting Rights Act was passed, southern states challenged the law as unconstitutional. They said the federal government couldn't tell states how to run their elections. This very quickly went to the Supreme Court, a very different Supreme Court than we have now, and the court said in an 8-1 decision, the Voting Rights Act was constitutional, that it was basically meant to enforce the 15th Amendment of 1870, which had been ignored for nearly 100 years. So that should have settled the debate. The law is upheld as constitutional, let's move on, let's debate something else. But what happened when the Voting Rights Act started to have an impact, when the first African Americans, the first Latinos, the first Asian Americans, the first women were elected for the first time, you began to hear a new argument against the Voting Rights Act, was that this was a form of affirmative action in the electoral arena, that it was helping some voters but hurting others. And interestingly enough, this argument begins to be made very aggressively in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan. And one of the people that makes this argument against the Voting Rights Act most aggressively is a guy by the name of John Roberts, who at the time was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department. And Roberts was tasked with weakening the Voting Rights Act. And he said in correspondence with the Reagan administration that, in his words, violations of the Voting Rights Act should not be made too easy to prove. I think this is really important because it's not like John Roberts woke up 30 years later and decided, you know what, I'm going to write the majority opinion in 2013 gutting the Voting Rights Act. I suddenly feel very strongly about this issue. This is something that he and others in the conservative movement had been trying to do for 30 plus years, and they were put on the Supreme Court precisely for that reason. But what's interesting is that Roberts fails. So parts of the Voting Rights Act were temporary and had to be renewed by the Congress. And the Congress actually renewed the Voting Rights Act 4 different times, in 1970, in 1975, in 1982, and in 2006. Each time the Voting Rights Act was renewed, it was passed by overwhelming margins in Congress, and every reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was signed by a Republican president, which I think is really interesting to remind people voting rights was something that used to have bipartisan support. But to me, the real breaking point when it comes to voting rights was after the 2000 election in Florida. I think a lot of people remember that election for hanging chads and butterfly ballots and Katherine Harris and elderly Jews mistakenly voting for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach. But there was a whole nother part of that election, which is that Florida is one of the only states in the country that prevents ex-felons from voting. This is something I'll talk about later. And the state claimed that all of these ex-felons, even after they had served their time, were on the voting rolls and needed to be purged from the voting rolls. So they sent these lists of supposed ex-felons to county supervisors all across the state and said, you need to purge people from the voting rolls. Well, there were two problems. First off, this purge was discriminatory. African Americans were 11% of the electorate in Florida, but 44% of those on the voter purge list. The second problem was that the purge was inaccurate. So what happened was people showed up to vote on Election Day in Florida 2000. They were wrongly told they were felons and couldn't vote. After the election, the NAACP sued the state of Florida over this purge. And the state of Florida admitted that 12,000 registered voters were wrongly labeled as felons and purged from the voting rolls. That was 22 times George W. Bush's 537 vote margin of victory in the state. And so some people learned one lesson after Florida, which is that this can never happen again. Other people learned a different lesson, which is that maybe this benefits us politically. Maybe there's a benefit in preventing people from voting. Maybe it will help one party and hurt the other. So fast forward to 2008. I think what's really interesting about 2008 is not only is the first black president elected, but 5 million new voters cast a ballot. Of those 5 million new voters, 2 million are African American, 2 million are Latino, 600,000 are Asian American. So they're almost entirely people of color. And they vote 75% from President Obama. So let's say you're the opposition party. And the fastest growing segments of the electorate have just voted in overwhelming numbers against you. What do? The way I see it as a political journalist, you only have two options. You can either change your policies to try to attract new people. That's typically what you would do in politics to try to win an election. Or you would choose a different strategy, a very old and time-worn strategy in American politics. You try to prevent those people that disagree with you from voting in the first place. And that's what happened suddenly when the other party got control of all of these key states after the 2010 election. Whether it was Texas or North Carolina or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania and Florida, we saw the same laws, basically identical, introduced in state after state after state. And then these efforts got a shot in the arm after the Supreme Court, in an opinion authored by John Roberts, who I just mentioned earlier, gutted the centerpiece of the Voting Rights Act. And after that decision, a few things happened. The first was that laws that were actually blocked as discriminatory, like Texas's voter ID law, where you could vote with a gun permit but not a student ID, were allowed to go into effect. The second thing that happened is that states passed more sweeping voting restrictions. So a month after the Supreme Court's decision, when John Roberts said that racial discrimination in voting was largely a thing of the past, North Carolina, which was one of the most progressive states in the South, passed a sweeping rewrite of its election laws. It required strict voter ID, it cut early voting, it eliminated same-day voter registration, it eliminated Citizens Awareness Month, which the state ran to encourage people to register to vote. All of this in one bill a month after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. This was challenged in federal court in 2016. And the court found that this law, in the court's words, targeted African Americans with, quote, almost surgical precision. And that some parts of the law were as close to a smoking gun as you'll ever see in modern times. And they cited one piece of evidence for this. North Carolina was a state that allowed Sunday voting. New York doesn't have early voting, we'll talk about that later, but in states that have early voting, Sunday is a very popular day to vote because a lot of people don't work. It's also the days when African American churches hold souls to the polls voter mobilization drives. So North Carolina's Republican-controlled legislature got rid of Sunday voting. And the court said, why did you get rid of Sunday voting? And the North Carolina legislature said, well, some people were using it more than others. and the court said, okay, who was using it more than others? And the legislature said, counties that were predominantly Democratic and had large African American populations. And the court said, you just admitted to us in federal court that you passed this law to try to disenfranchise people based on their party, but even more significantly under the Voting Rights Act, based on their race. And that's why they struck this law down. So there was clear evidence after the Supreme Court said discrimination was a thing of the past, of the very type of discrimination that the Voting Rights Act was passed to stop in the first place. The third thing that happened, and this was distressing to me as a Northerner, was voter suppression spread to the North. A lot of people like to think of voter suppression as a Southern thing, that it's happening in Alabama and Mississippi, but it's not happening here or there. But I spent Election Day 2016 in Wisconsin, which was one of the most progressive states historically for voting rights. It was a state that consistently, along with Minnesota since the 1970s, had the highest voter turnout in the country and was really committed to good governance no matter who was in control of the state. But that changed in 2016 when Wisconsin adopted a strict voter ID law that 300,000 voters didn't have, according to a federal court. And I hear this all the time, and I'm sure you hear it too, what's the big deal? Doesn't everyone have an ID? Don't you need an ID to buy Sudafed or buy beer or cash a check? And we can debate that some other time. What we can't debate is that there were people that not only didn't have this ID, but tried to get these IDs and couldn't. And so I wrote about a 58-year-old African-American man who moved from Chicago to Milwaukee by the name of Eddie Lee Holloway Jr. He was someone who had a Chicago ID, had an ID from Illinois, but that was not valid for voting in Wisconsin. So he could use it to board a plane and buy Sudafed and get beer, but he couldn't use it to vote in Wisconsin. So he went down to the DMV in Milwaukee and he said, I want to get an ID for voting. but they didn't give him an ID because the name on his Illinois ID said Eddie Jr. Holloway, because of a clerical error, instead of Eddie Lee Holloway Jr. So same first name, same last name, clerical error in the middle name. You think this would easily be resolved, but it wasn't. They told him to go down to the Vital Records office in Milwaukee and get his birth certificate amended. He went down to Vital Records in Milwaukee. He said, how much will it cost to amend my birth certificate? They said between $400 and $600. They said he had to go back to Illinois and do it there. So he took a bus from Milwaukee to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital. He went to Springfield and he said, I want to amend my birth certificate. They said they needed to see his high school and his vaccination records. He went to Decatur, Illinois, where he was from, got his high school records, went back to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, and said, can I now amend my birth certificate? They said, no, we need to see your full Social Security statement, which he didn't have on him. He went back to Wisconsin. He got all his documents in order. He contacted Vital Records in Illinois, and he said, can I amend my birth certificate? Can I send it by fax or email? They said, no, you have to come back in person. And at this point in time, this one voter, Eddie Lee Holloway Jr., gave up. He made 7 trips to different public agencies, spent over $180 of his own money in 2 different states, and still wasn't able to vote in 2016. And what really bothered me was I heard so many stories in 2016 about how people weren't excited to vote, but how there was so much apathy in the country. And it's true, there were people that could have voted that didn't. There were people that weren't excited about the candidate, but there was an entirely different story. There were people who were excited to vote, that went to Herculean efforts to try to vote, but were disenfranchised because of voter suppression. And one of the things that bothered me as a journalist was there was 25 presidential debates during the primary and general election season, and there wasn't a single question about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. The fact that this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And I did a story for Mother Jones. When I joined Mother Jones, my first story was about what happened in Wisconsin. And we found, based on academic studies, based on interviews, based on talking to election officials, that tens of thousands of people were prevented from voting in that state, enough to tip the margin from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And so people ask me all the time, did voter suppression have an impact on the election? And I say, absolutely, it had an impact. I've documented it. But even if it had no impact on the election, the fact that one party deliberately made it harder for people to vote was a huge political scandal that deserved far more attention and outrage. So I want to talk about where we are today. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. I'll get to some good news, but let's get to the bad news first. This last session at the Supreme Court was the worst that I've ever seen for voting rights. You have to go back to the Jim Crow era to find a term where the Supreme Court so consistently voted against protecting the right to vote. The court upheld voter purging in Ohio. It upheld racial gerrymandering in Texas. It had 2 different cases before it that could have ended partisan gerrymandering and threw both of those cases out. So many opportunities to protect voting rights, no decisions that did so. And then on the last day of the term, when I was inconveniently on vacation, Anthony Kennedy said, I'm retiring. Now, when it comes to voting rights, Anthony Kennedy was not really a swing justice. I want to be honest here. He joined Bush versus Gore. He joined the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. He authored Citizens United, which allowed billionaires to buy American elections. He's only considered a swing justice because the court has moved so far to the right. That said, his replacement is going to be worse. I was doing some research on Brett Kavanaugh yesterday. One of the first things that I found was that he upheld a voter ID law from South Carolina that the Obama Justice Department blocked and said would disenfranchise tens of thousands of minority voters. So that gives an inkling into the kind of justice he will be. He will be someone who is hostile to voting rights. He is someone who will be hostile to civil rights. He is someone who was put on the court to carry out a very specific agenda of the Federalist Society, of the Heritage Foundation, I think even more disturbingly, of the Republican Party. Because I think we don't just have a conservative court now, we have a Republican court, which means they are going to uphold the very laws that Republicans are passing to try to rig the electorate and therefore enshrine this kind of election rigging that we saw in Wisconsin as settled law. And that's what really disturbs me, because this is a 30 to 40-year project that the right has had, and they're finally succeeding in carrying it out. And I think what's unfortunate is that there's so much in this country that we could be doing to make it easier to vote. And in fact, some states are doing this right now, and there actually is some good news when it comes to voting rights. I'll give you one example. In 2016, Oregon became the first state to pass automatic voter registration. Basically, what happens in Oregon, if you go to the DMV and they can confirm that you are a US citizen, that you're over 18, and that you're a resident of the state, you will automatically be registered to vote. You don't even have to say, I want to register. They will automatically register you to vote. This policy in Oregon registered 300,000 new voters in the last election. And Oregon, despite not even being a swing state, had the highest increase in the country in voter turnout. And to me, this is the wave of the future when it comes to voting rights. And interestingly, 13 states have now passed automatic voter registration in just 2 years, which shows that when you actually put some effort into expanding the electorate, into making an affirmative argument for why people should be able to vote, actually a lot of people respond to it. And automatic registration hasn't just passed in blue states. It passed via referendum in Alaska, of all places. It was signed into law in West Virginia. So to me, this is the wave of the future. And I think as a New Yorker, it's really unfortunate that we don't have these kind of laws, because we are thought of as this progressive state in a lot of different respects, but we have some of the worst voting laws in the country. And when I was in North Carolina covering that trial I told you about, the law that was blocked with almost surgical precision, the lawyer for the state of North Carolina, who by the way has now been nominated by Donald Trump to be a federal judge, got up and he said, why does North Carolina need 21 days of early voting if New York doesn't have any? And I was sitting in the courtroom, and as a Northerner, I was offended. And I wanted to say, how dare you Southerners lecture us on voting rights? But then I had to admit, he kind of had a point, that we don't have early voting. And we are now being invoked by some of the worst states for voter suppression as an excuse to do this kind of thing. And so the last time I talked in New York, I had a little cheat sheet about all the laws that other states have that we don't have. And luckily, I found it in my pocket right before I came here. 37 states have early voting. New York has no early voting. 27 states have no excuse absentee ballots. You don't need a reason to get an absentee ballot. New York requires a reason under penalty of perjury to get an absentee ballot. 15 states have election day registration. You can register and vote on the same day, which increases voter turnout more than any other reform, because so many people don't get it together to register in time. We don't have election day registration. 13 states have automatic voter registration, which I think is the wave of the future for voting rights. We don't have automatic registration. And so as New Yorkers, I think you absolutely should care about what's happening in Wisconsin and North Carolina and Texas. It's outrageous what's taking place in those states. But it's also outrageous what's happening in our own backyard, that we haven't gotten it together to at least become the 38th state to pass early voting. So I'm hopeful that will change as well. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, so I'm just going to end with three takeaways that I believe are important for voting rights. And if someone comes in and asks you, what did Ari say tonight? You don't have to worry about all the statistics, just tell them these three things. The first thing that I believe is that the vote is a right, not a privilege. That too many people have died in this country for the right to vote, for us to once again come up with new ways to restrict it. The second thing I believe is that democracy works better when more people participate. I happen to believe that it's no coincidence that New York has some of the highest rates of legislators going to jail and some of the worst voting laws in the country. I think a lot of people have become comfortable with power here and don't want to give it up. And I think that the elected officials are more responsive to the electorate when more people show up. The last thing I believe is that voter suppression is fundamentally immoral. That this is not a right versus left issue, this is not a Democratic or Republican issue, that it is fundamentally wrong to prevent people from voting. And if that is your strategy to win an election, you should get another job. So with that, I will end and happy to take a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have two questions.
Yep.
Do you think voting should be compulsory?
It's an interesting experiment. So let me just contextualize it for a second. The question was, should voting be compulsory? Australia has had compulsory voting since the 1920s. And basically, Australia had very low voter turnout, and they came up with a radical solution. And their basic idea was that the vote is not a right, it's not a privilege, it's a responsibility. That if you want to live here, this is something you just have to do. And it's not like Australia is the world's most functional democracy. They have scandals too. But they don't have the kind of voter suppression that we have, where every election you're arguing about the voting laws because everyone is able to vote. So I don't think it's going to fly in this country, where you see "Don't tread on me" flags all over the place. But I think it's an interesting idea and an interesting experiment that they've done there.
The other question I have is, let's see if I can say it properly. Do you think that the people who, especially judges who participate in decision-making that suppresses voting, do you think that it's class prejudice? Do you think it's just a desire to win? What makes people like that?
That's a good question. What do judges think who pass these kind of laws, who uphold these kind of laws? I think it's twofold. I think some of them are carrying out the agenda of the party that nominated them. I think it's very clear some of them are doing the bidding, and they realize it's going to benefit some people and others. I think at the same time, they've developed a very elaborate ideology to justify discrimination without seeming discriminatory. So what you began to see happen in the 1970s, and this was something that was really embraced by John Roberts in the 80s, was they came up with this idea of colorblindness. That basically, yeah, discrimination was bad, but you know what? So is busing. So is affirmative action. So are districts that help African Americans get elected. That we're against discrimination, but we don't want color to be considered at all. And that was very convenient because that sounded great. Of course, who wants to consider color if we don't have to? The problem is they were making this argument at a time when there was a huge disparity between races when it came to education, to housing, to voting. We weren't anywhere near a colorblind society, but they wanted to treat it as such and use that as an excuse to roll back the civil rights movement. So I think you've seen basically every justice that is now nominated to the court by a Republican believes in this idea of colorblindness. And they basically convinced themselves that this is the morally superior ideology, that they are the ones who are freeing the country of discrimination, when in fact all they're doing is entrenching historic discrimination.
Yeah. Would you like to talk about prisoner enfranchisement?
Yeah.
You know, partly because there are states that permit it, and we're also an outlier when you look at other countries.
Yeah.
And also, with this being such an important issue, would you like to talk about how we're also being distracted by being told that the election was swung by other things that are far less important?
I'll stick to the first question for now. The question was about felon disenfranchisement. I think it's a huge issue that across the country, 6 million people can't vote because of felon disenfranchisement laws. And it varies state by state. Some people can't vote when they're on parole. Some people can't vote if they're on probation. Some people can't vote if they have outstanding fines. There are a few states, most notably Florida, that just prevent ex-felons from voting altogether, that even after you've served your debt to society, you can't vote. And one of the most interesting campaigns in 2018 is going to be a ballot initiative in Florida to overturn that felon disenfranchisement law. And that is so critical because 1.5 million people in Florida can't vote because of this law. And just think of the margins in Florida, 537 votes in 2000. Even in the last election, Donald Trump only beat Hillary Clinton by 112,000 votes. You have 1.5 million people disenfranchised. 10% of the adult population in Florida can't vote, including 1 in 5 African Americans. That is staggering to me that in one of the most important swing states in the country, 1 in 5 African Americans are disenfranchised even after they've paid their debt to society. So this amendment to overturn felon disenfranchisement is one of the most interesting things that I'm following in 2018. One thing that I forgot to say about the courts is that as the courts move further and further in a direction of not protecting voting rights, I think that mass voter mobilization and going directly to the people is going to be increasingly important. And so it's not just Florida. In Michigan this year, they're going to vote on election day registration, automatic registration. They're going to vote on independent gerrymandering. In Nevada, they're going to vote on automatic registration. So initiatives aren't the only way to do this, but it's one way where you don't have to rely on the courts to uphold your law. You don't have to have faith in the fifth conservative justice to try to rule for you. You can try to go directly to the people. You can mobilize people. And I think what's happening in Florida is really important because it's not just going to potentially transform the state's electorate. It's also going to get a lot of people out to vote who care about criminal justice issues who might not otherwise vote in a midterm election, particularly a lot of young people, a lot of young voters of color that might be turned off by both parties, but care a lot about ending mass incarceration and see felon disenfranchisement as a key piece in preserving mass incarceration.
Hi, could you talk a little bit about what were the arguments in Alaska and West Virginia that worked for automatic voter registration?
For automatic registration? So it's really, really interesting. Basically in West Virginia, they were going to pass a voter ID law. And what the Democrats said is, okay, this is now basically a Republican state. We'll give you voter ID, but we want automatic registration in return. So it was kind of a grand bargain. They passed one bad law, but they passed another law that, at least if you're going to the DMV, you're going to get automatically registered. Alaska was really fascinating. Alaska has basically a reserve of money based on how much oil they have. And everyone in the state signs up for that oil revenue fund. Now when you sign up for that oil revenue fund, you will automatically be registered to vote. And that's the kind of innovative policy we could be doing in other places. We don't need a one-size-fits-all solution. The point is that if we want to try to figure out a way to get people registered, we can do it in this day and age. And it could even be something like in Alaska where you know people are signing up for oil money, you might as well get them registered at the same time.
I have two questions. Maybe you can choose one. One is you talked a little bit about John Roberts and the ongoing project. If you could talk maybe a little bit about Jeff Sessions and the role of the DOJ, since Alabama is such a favorite state to hate in voting.
Sure.
And the other is on racial gerrymandering, and that is also like a new battle. How do you see that playing out in the forthcoming elections?
Well, I mean, I think someone like John Roberts has kind of tried to effectively make a new kind of argument for discrimination. I think Jeff Sessions just made a very old argument for discrimination, which is that, you know, I am an unreconstructed Southerner who grew up in this era and still believes a lot of those things. And I mean, it was just something that, You know, that was one of the situations where Donald Trump was different than any other Republican. I think you would have had a Republican president. I'm not saying they would have nominated a good attorney general, but they would not have nominated Jeff Sessions, who was a very unremarkable senator who had some of the most extreme politics in his coalition. And despite Trump basically bad-mouthing him every day, he is one of the most influential figures in the Trump administration. He is driving their policies on voting. He is driving their policies on immigration, along with Stephen Miller. And so I think he is one of the most influential, I think one of the most destructive attorney generals in my lifetime. And if you look at his record on voting rights, one of the things that Jeff Sessions did, which I think should have disqualified him from ever being considered as attorney general, when he was a prosecutor in Alabama in the 1980s, he prosecuted people that nearly died marching for voting rights in Selma in the 1960s for voter fraud, for completely bogus cases of voter fraud. What happened in Alabama was that you would help people cast absentee ballots. You would go by their house, you would help them cast absentee ballots if they were elderly or one reason or another. White politicians did this all the time. But suddenly when black politicians started doing this, they were charged with voter fraud. So this was a very, very contentious issue in Alabama. Jeff Sessions was actually blocked from becoming a federal judge, largely because of this case, because the convictions were thrown out and because it was viewed as such a black mark on his record. That obviously didn't stop him from being elected senator, and didn't stop him from being elected as attorney general, but I mean, we're in a place about history. History really matters here. When you look at the backgrounds of someone like Jeff Sessions, you understand why they're doing the things they're doing today. I don't have the mic.
How do we go about getting New York State to extend voting rights other than perhaps asking Cynthia Nixon to take it on, in which case Cuomo will adopt it? But do we just start by writing and calling our assembly and state senators, or have you got some better ideas? Because that hasn't always done anything.
I mean, I would say that the simplest answer, and I don't endorse candidates, but just elect different people. I mean, these elections are not decided by that many votes. If you would just be able to increase turnout a little bit in a few of these districts, you would have a very different legislature. And it's really one branch of the legislature that's blocking a lot of this from happening. The other branch of the legislature is on board with a lot of these reforms. And I think, you know, the governor has not always been the strongest supporter of voting rights. I'll just put it that way. And I think a lot of people who support the governor, who support voting rights, have not necessarily put a lot of pressure on him on this issue. That, to me, supporting the right to vote has to be a foundational issue. In the same way that people care about a woman's right to choose, or a clean environment, or a higher minimum wage. These are benchmark issues. If you're not for these things, you're not going to be elected the Democratic governor of New York. But somehow you can be elected the Democratic governor of New York and not really want more people to vote. And I think that's very, very problematic. And I think this has been raised in the governor's race. The governor has moved a little bit, but there was an opportunity to pass early voting in the last legislative session, and it died. And I didn't really see the heavy hitters in New York pushing that hard for it. And again, this would make us the 38th state in the country to pass early voting. This is not a radical reform that we're talking about here. We're not talking about compulsory voting. We're just talking about being able to vote on the Friday or the Saturday or the Sunday before the election. I mean, I had that experience where, you know, I was in Wisconsin on election day 2016. And, you know, I like voting in person. And, you know, I have a 3-year-old daughter in addition to a 2-month-old daughter, and I really like taking the 3-year-old to vote. She likes to get the I voted sticker. She kind of terrorizes the polling place, but in a cute way. And to just get an absentee ballot was a ridiculous process in New York. I mean, I could have gone there, but I was really busy. So basically what I had to do is I had to figure out, you know, where the Board of Elections was. I had to send in a form to get an absentee ballot. I had to get the absentee ballot in the mail, make sure I got it in time. I had to sign under penalty of perjury why I needed an absentee ballot. Then I had to pay for the postage and return the absentee ballot back. Now that doesn't seem like a lot of work. I was easily able to do it, but it was 4 different steps I had to take to do it, as opposed to walking a block from my apartment 3 days before the election if we had early voting. And I think that's the kind of thing. A lot of people are already lukewarm about voting in this country. If you just erect one little obstacle, they decide why bother. And that's what we're seeing. with a lot of these voter suppression laws, it's not about just blanket, let's prevent people from voting, although there is some of that. It's just, let's make it a little bit more confusing. Let's close a polling place here. Let's eliminate an early voting place there. Let's purge a voter here. All of it basically serves as a deterrent for people wanting being able to participate. Yeah.
I'm going back in history. You mentioned the rights and privilege debate.
Yeah.
And John Roberts back during Reagan days. I'm thinking, isn't there some, what is the, we would have a better chance of blowing the right versus privilege argument out of the water if maybe we had a better sense of who were the conspirators in the 60s and 70s. Were they academics? Were they politicians? Were there a group of guys in a smoke-filled room who said, let's nail this voting thing down so that we can get it all in our favor? How do we, was there, that's my first question, my basic question. What were the intellectual structure that the right and privilege thing was based on?
Well, that's a very good reason to buy my book, because I talk about that extensively in a way that is not easily summarized in 2 minutes. I think basically what you had was an alliance between Southern conservatives who always hated the Voting Rights Act and wanted to get rid of it, needed to rebrand, and Northern, basically neoconservatives, people that were formerly liberals that became conservatives, partly because of their antipathy towards what they viewed as what the civil rights movement had become in the 1970s, and they were trying to rebrand their opposition to civil rights laws to not seem discriminatory. And so it was kind of this odd coalition that was able to do it. And then obviously a lot of opportunistic politicians latched onto it and said, well, we can benefit politically from not doing this. But I think you raise a larger question about why we always have this rights versus privilege argument, which is that we don't have a fundamental guarantee of voting rights in our Constitution. We have a lot of things you can't do, theoretically. You can't discriminate against people on the basis of race. You can't prevent women from voting. You can't prevent people from voting if they're over 18. We have all these things you can't do. But we don't have a simple line in the Constitution that says something like everyone has the right to vote except for X, Y, and Z. A lot of other countries have that in their constitutions. We don't. And that's one reason I think that we keep having this debate, because our founders, many of whom were slaveholders, made a very conscious decision not to do this. It wasn't like it wasn't debated. In the 1770s and the 1780s, it was debated. They made a conscious decision not to make the right to vote a fundamental right because they wanted to restrict that right. And we're still living in many ways with that history today. Two more questions? Yeah. What? Okay, that's it. Sorry. Okay, I apologize. I'm happy to talk afterwards. And thank you guys for coming, and thank you, C-SPAN, for filming it.